2024 marks 30 years since the passing of one of F1's all-time greats. For some, to hear the name Ayrton Senna will conjure up images of his final few moments at that fateful weekend at Imola, that iconic yellow, green and blue helmet twinned with the blue and white Williams, and a swirl of unanswered questions. Others will remember Ayrton as perhaps he would best wish to be, encased in his Marlborough-striped McLaren, accelerating to any one of his 3 world titles, securing another dominant pole position, or romping to another success on the streets of Monaco. Or, alternatively, during some of those less than flattering McLaren moments that will forever remain burned into our retinas. There'll be another group who think of a youthful, baby-faced Senna, announcing himself on the world's biggest stage as he hustles his Toleman around Monaco in appalling conditions, catching Alain Prost's superior McLaren hand over foot, only being denied a sensational first win by what some would call the most questionable of red flags. And beyond that, we're left with one final image of Ayrton that perhaps, inadvertently, gets forgotten about more often than not. Aesthetically, it's certainly one of the most stunning, the combination of that famous helmet being nestled among one of my and many others' favourite liveries of all time, the John Player Special Black and Gold that bedecks the legendary Lotus mark for oh so many years. But beyond that artistically splendid visual, what do we remember of Ayrton at this time, this in-between period as he traversed from bristling potential to championship glory? The record books will show he was fast, very fast. Of the 48 Grand Prix Senna drove for Lotus, he was on pole 16 times, or 1 in every 3 outings. The 2 world champions of those years, Prost and Nelson Piquet, combined, only scored 10. Indeed, if we ran the World Championship based on qualifying results alone, as wonderfully detailed by my friend Peter Brook, Senna would have been a 2-time world champion by the end of 1987. Yet, as they say, the race is never won on a Saturday, and in stark contrast to that Saturday supremacy is the win column tally from that same time, which reads a somewhat underwhelming 6. Senna joined Lotus hoping, nay assuming, that here was an outfit that would take him to World Championship glory, as it had done so many great talents of the past. Instead, he would depart for McLaren 3 years later, with a handful of wins and 0 world titles. The question I want to pose today is just what was the Lotus legacy of Ayrton Senna? Is the stark contrast between poles and wins indicative of a latter-day Leclerc, super speedy on Saturdays and unable to replicate that on race day? Was this a time of unfulfilled potential, hampered by machinery like a retro Raikkonen? Or is the answer a little bit more positive than that? Let's delve into those Lotus years and see if we can't answer that. Before we begin our tale, it's perhaps beneficial to give a sense of perspective of just who Lotus were and the state they were in at the time. The phrase fallen giants perhaps best applies. Ever present on the grid as far back as 1958, Lotus's lineage consists of a veritable who's who of F1 greats. Jim Clark, Graham Hill, Jochen Rindt, Emerson Fittipaldi, Mario Andretti, all achieved championship glory with Lotus, not to mention names like Ronnie Peterson or Sterling Moss too. In a Venn diagram of legendary drivers and Grand Prix victories, Lotus would be slap bang in the middle of it all. Key behind so much of Lotus's success was their visionary founder, Colin Chapman. Many of his innovations and ideas remain integral to modern-day racers' own hopes of victory. Monocoque chassis to lighten and strengthen bodies, wings to improve aerodynamic flow and increase downforce, pioneering ground effect, creating a low pressure under the car to generate suction and hold it securely to the road. Not to mention now banned notions, skirts for generating ground effect, and a dual chassis car. Former Lotus sales director Graham Arnold described him as an incredible bloke who could do anything better than the next man. If he'd been in charge of the Royal Shakespeare Company, within a year he'd either have produced the most definitive, most controversial, or most controversially definitive Macbeth. But by the 1980s, it seemed the peak Lotus years were behind them. A drivers' and constructors' title double in 1978 had subsequently been followed by just a solitary win across the next 4 years. When Chapman died from a massive heart attack in December of 1982, Lotus lost not just their founder, but their inspiration. The Lotus cars, even after switching to Renault engines, continued to prove far from competitive. Decade-long sponsors JPS were openly querying whether they'd continue to support the team. It was hard not to believe that this was the beginning of the end for this once mighty marque. Into some enormous shoes stepped Peter Waugh, who had been the straight man to Chapman's hot-headedness for so many years before. And somehow, amidst all the chaos, he managed to steer Lotus in the right direction. Key was his inspired hiring of former Matra, Ligier and Alfa Romeo engineer Gérard Ducarouge. Duca, as he was known, wasn't just brought in to doodle designs. His energy brought life back into the design team, somewhat rudderless without Chapman. Within a month of his arrival, the hastily designed 94T debuted at the British Grand Prix. Nigel Mansell brought it home in 4th place, their best result of the year, and a result that many attribute to convincing JPS to stay on, thus saving Lotus. Results picked up, and between Mansell and teammate Elio De Angelis, the duo delivered 7 podiums across the remainder of 83 and 84, as Lotus soared into 3rd place, their highest placing since that last title. Lotus had gone from floundering to flying high. The next step, a return to the winner's circle, was tantalizingly within reach. What was needed to take that next step? In Waugh's opinion, a top-line driver. Talented a pairing as the incumbent Lotus duo were, Waugh felt that De Angelis lacked the hunger to succeed, whilst infamously declared Mansell as simply not good enough. Leaving aside how misplaced such a judgment might have been, Waugh had his eyes on a shining new talent, one he described as the most naturally talented driver I'd seen since Jim Clark. The first hints of contact between Senna and Lotus can be traced all the way to March 1982. The 22-year-old was in just his 2nd season of single-seater racing, tackling a dual campaign into both British and European Formula Ford 2000. A young motorsport photographer by the name of Keith Sutton recognised Ayrton's talents and mooted the idea of doing press releases for the young gun to be sent to all the Grand Prix managers. Tales of Senna's exploits would now reach the likes of Bernie Ecclestone of Brabham, Frank Williams of, strangely enough, Williams, and yes, Peter Waugh. Just a few months later, Sutton recounts returning home to find a pile of messages from the likes of Williams and Waugh, all wanting to talk about Ayrton and make contact with him. Said contact would translate into a series of F1 tests for Senna in 1983, as he simultaneously mounted a title challenge in British Formula 3. The soon-to-be famous Senna helmet sat behind the wheel of the likes of Brabham, McLaren and Williams, and he impressed. When he tested for Williams at Donington, he went fastest of all, beating even Williams' reigning champion Keke Rosberg. The trouble was, none had race seats to offer up. Williams were full. Brabham's hands were tied by the wishes of sponsor Parmalat to sign an Italian driver, whilst the best McLaren could offer was a testing role, with a long-term deal that would tie him to a race drive further down the line. With all the top spots on the grid unavailable, it seemed Ayrton would have to set his sights a little lower down the field for an F1 promotion in 1984. But then again, maybe not. Waugh wanted Senna too, and was more than happy to boot out his bestest pal Mansell to make the space for that to happen. The two went as far as agreeing terms in the Lotus offices for what would have been a bargain $50,000. But F1 is rarely as straightforward as signing a contract, and it wouldn't be long till other forces came into play. Waugh recalls that at Brands Hatch, De Angelis had put his car on the front row, Mansell on the second. The next morning I opened the British papers to see the hollering headline of "Mansell on the second row." and that kind of publicity comfortably trounced any bristling potential Senna had, and JPS insisted that Mansell be kept on. Begrudgingly, Ward did so, and Senna wound up at relative minnows Toleman for his F1 debut. There he would perform some legendary heroics, the highlight being a sensational second place on the sodden streets of Monaco. It was soon clear that young Senna had already outgrown Toleman, and it was seemingly a question of when and not if he would find a seat further up the field that would allow him to truly shine. He and Ward had kept in touch, and by July at the Dallas Grand Prix, meetings began between Lotus, Senna and the Brazilian's manager. But it was far from a smooth process. Firstly, Senna's 1984 performances had driven up his asking price from a $50,000 steal to an eye-watering $585,000. And then came the weekend of the Dutch Grand Prix. Toleman's managing director, Alex Hawkridge, received a bolt from the blue when two journalists arrived at the Toleman motorhome, brandishing a press release from Lotus that Senna had signed for them. Whilst Toleman had known Senna would likely move on from their outfit, he didn't have the right to enter into an agreement with anybody else before he'd advised us and released himself from his contract, said Hawkridge. To make matters worse, several guests and sponsors had been in the Toleman motorhome at the time, with whom Hawkridge had been negotiating a multi-million-pound sponsorship, only for the Senna bombshell to, quote, destroy our credibility, that we didn't know what the hell was going on within our own team. Though this drama would lead to Toleman suspending Senna for the following race in Italy, Ayrton was a blameless party. According to him, he had been giving indications since Canada that he was looking for the exit, and though he knew of Lotus's intent to make the announcement that weekend, he had also requested the opportunity to inform Toleman first, as any person in possession of a working moral compass would do. But that opportunity was snatched away through an uncontrollable situation. Though inevitable, the Senna and Lotus announcement had been fast-forwarded due to pressures from JPS. Though long-standing partners with Lotus, their new sales and marketing director Brian Ray was less than convinced in the ongoing expenditure of motor racing. He arrived in Zandvoort promised, though by no one at Lotus, of a motorhome lunch with the British presses to stroke his ego as he shared with them the breaking news that would leave them all sprinting to the phone booths. Soon, journalists with ties to the likes of Lotus and Senna heard all about this. The embargo on the story was broken, and before that lunch could even commence, the paddock was awash with the hottest piece of gossip. An acrimonious beginning then, but putting aside the whole unpleasantness, it was the next best step for Ayrton. He had climbed the rungs below F1 and now found himself scaling further rungs through F1, graduating from the tiny Toleman operation to the larger Lotus one. No longer a dormant power, but one that could offer him a starter of Grand Prix wins to follow his podium aperitif, and quite possibly a main course of freshly baked World Championship. The new Lotus 97T was a simple but quick and nimble design, having incorporated some ideas from a stillborn IndyCar project. Its Renault engines were reckoned to be good for around 1200 brake horsepower and had separate smaller turbo engines for race day to reduce power lag. Though that meant they trumped the front-running tag Porsche units of the McLarens by around 200 bhp, they also crucially trailed them in both reliability and efficiency stakes. Yet all and any deficiencies at the operation would quickly be counterbalanced by the sheer force of will from Senna. Quickly, Ayrton would become the focus point for the whole team. One of Senna's mechanics, Chris Dinage, says that Ayrton had the same raw pace as Mansell, but he was only using 50% of his capacity as a human to drive the car at full speed, leaving him the other 50% to be really aware of everything that was going on around him. His concentration levels were unparalleled. Another, Nigel Stepney, said that whilst De Angelis was a popular figure, Senna came along and after a while had the whole nucleus of the team working for him. Senna seemed to exude an energy and enthusiasm that galvanized the whole outfit, in much the way Duca had done so behind the scenes. War, recognizing that newly installed team spirit, declared, "If we can make the car finish the races, Senna is going to win the championship. Simple as that. If only it was. The phrase, "start as you mean to go on," seems appropriate here. Senna and De Angelis were rapid at the season opener in Brazil, topping practice and qualifying, and only denied a front-row lockout by last-gasp efforts from Rosberg's Williams and Michele Alboretto's Ferrari. When Rosberg, then McLaren's Niki Lauda, fell by the wayside, Senna was set for an easy third place before the ignition system failed. It was the first of 8 mechanical retirements that year from the 16 races, a literal flip of the coin as to whether Ayrton would reach the finish. Things landed right side up in Portugal, where Ayrton took the first of his 65 career poles, a full second clear of De Angelis. Then came race day and one of Senna's greatest performances. A torrent of rain had descended on the circuit, and despite Ayrton having never driven his 97T in the wet, with the added handicap of having had his engine and gearbox replaced after the warm-up, he launched smoothly into the lead and never looked back. In treacherous conditions with the likes of Prost and Rosberg spinning off, Senna romped to victory. After 20 laps he was half a minute clear of second, and by race end had lapped everyone bar Alboretto, with fastest lap to boot. Many declare Senna's exploits at Donington 93 as his greatest drive, but Senna himself has said no way, I had traction control then. Estoril was a hard tactical race, corner by corner, because conditions were changing all the time. The car was sliding everywhere. I even had 4 wheels on the grass. 2 more wins from 2 more poles should have promptly followed, and didn't. In San Marino he tore off into the lead, resisted a mid-race challenge from Prost and subsequently led for 56 of the 60 laps. He was 10 seconds clear of second place Stefan Johansson on lap 57 when the Renault V6 coughed, spluttered and declared itself out of fuel. In Monaco his tyre warmers short-circuited before the start, blistering his front tyres and prompting the team into changing them. Yet despite cold fronts and warm rears creating a very unbalanced car, Senna still led the opening 13 laps before the engine failed. With his deep-rooted Monaco mastery, the win was surely on without either of those troubles. After 4 races, De Angelis led the World Championship. Few would argue that it should have been the other Lotus on top of the pile. He finally saw the checkered flag again in Canada, albeit a lowly 16th, after pitting from second place on lap 6 with a turbo issue, and subsequently losing 5 laps in the process, resulting in a glorified test session with an unimportant fastest lap to boot. On a weekend where De Angelis had the measure of him and who only finished 5th thanks to more poor Renault fuel consumption, 6th might have been the best Senna could have mustered that day. In Portugal we had seen Senna's wet weather wonders first emerge, and now in Detroit we saw another of his famous talents come to the fore, a mastery of street circuits. Stepney isolated this brilliance, stating that they all take risks, but I don't believe he took bigger risks than the others. He had not just speed, but a purity. He cut every corner finer. He went closer to the barriers, and he didn't just do it for 1 lap. He could do it for a whole race. On Saturday, Senna qualified 2 seconds faster than everyone else, bar Mansell and Alboretto, prompting McLaren coordinator Joe Ramirez to stroll down to Lotus and ask, okay, which shortcut did he take? Race day was less successful as an early lead was mitigated by dreadful tyre wear. Pitting on lap 8, he emerged in 14th but set about on a monumental charge. By lap 51, he was up to 4th, setting the fastest lap of the race and closing in on Alboretto when he hit the tyre barrier. My own fault, admitted the Brazilian. Another podium went by the wayside in France when his gear selectors jammed early on whilst running 3rd, and any hopes of another heroic charge through the field were quashed a few laps later when the engine blew. After that came another 2 lost wins. In Britain he qualified 4th despite suffering from engine problems throughout practice and qualifying. He roared into the lead at the start and stayed there for 57 of the 65 laps. Then the engine misfired, allowing Prost through, and 5 laps later the sounds of a toddler sucking on a juice box could be heard as the fuel ran dry once more. In Germany, he suffered a horrendous pre-race, with a loose rubber washer restricting him to just one lap in first qualifying before a wet second. Despite that, he still qualified 5th and probably ran second behind Rosberg. On lap 16, he took the lead and held it for 11 lovely laps before the CV joint failed. At this point in the season, Senna had seen the checkered flag just twice from the opening 9 rounds. Only once had actually been a point-scoring finish. Dreams of the world title were shattered by the harsh reality of being a lowly 9th, 37 points adrift of leader Alboreto, a gap that would have been an awful lot closer had 4 wins not gone down the toilet at this stage, not to mention a handful of podiums. Thankfully, Senna's luck would turn, and the next 5 races brought about 5 well overdue trips to the rostrum. Austria was his worst qualifying of the year, a lowly 14th, with the Lotus not enjoying the bumpy track, causing Senna to declare, "If we cannot get the balance of the car better, I may as well stop after 5 laps." It would be the last time Ayrton ever started outside of the top 10. He was into the points by lap 15, eventually finishing a distant second to Prost. One can argue that without his issues in qualifying, Senna could have started further up and been in hunt for victory, though it is hard to argue that even that could have overcome the 30-second advantage Prost had that day. Back-to-back thirds in Holland and Italy, wherein the most exciting thing was Senna tackling the Monza circuit for the first time, forgot there was a chicane at the first corner and promptly barreled into it at 5th gear, were followed by a welcome return to the top step of the podium in Belgium, even despite the engine missing occasionally at the halfway mark. Brands Hatch brought forth yet another Senna pole, and most impressive of all, he averaged 140.1 miles an hour around the circuit, the fastest lap around Brands ever. Veteran John Watson followed behind Senna for a lap and said, "It was a master controlling a machine. I had never seen a turbo car driven like that. I went down to Lotus and I said, 'I've just seen something,' and they said, 'Yes, we know.'" Only a Keke Rosberg masterclass in defensive driving and blocking stopped that being replicated into a win the next day. After a nothing of a race in South Africa, where Senna toured for just 8 laps before the Renault showed off its favourite party trick, a year's worth of frustrations perhaps reared its head in Australia with one of Senna's more chaotic performances. He bumped and bashed with the Williamses, and though he lost his front right wing, he still found himself in the lead by lap 61 before engine failure number 5 of the year. In reality, Senna scored 38 points to rank 4th, but with a hypothetical perfect season, one with no mechanical failures or personal errors, Senna could have won 7 races, had 7 further podiums, and would have seen his points tally soar to a magnificent 99 points. Even when you apply the championship criteria of only counting the best 11 scores from the 16 rounds, Senna could have still scored 83 points, comfortably clear of Prost in this mildly warped reality. It would have been a then record for most points scored in a year. This, of course, is with enough ifs, buts, candy and nuts to fill a Wonka bar, as opposed to Kimi Raikkonen when we analysed his McLaren tenure. Accounting for reliability is a tad trickier for a what-if scenario here. Unlike Kimi's woes, which were a clear outlier compared to the vastly more superior reliability records of his championship foes in the mid-2000s, reliability in the 80s was, much like a Kevin Magnussen overtake, much less of a sure thing. Naturally, if we tweak history to provide Senna with a bulletproof Lotus and assume the best results possible from his retirements, then it can be little surprise to see Ayrton vault and skip up the standings. With enough jiggery-pokery, you could probably argue the same for any other number of frontrunners in that era. So for the sake of fairness, let's look at the average reliability record for the frontrunners each year and apply a best-case scenario onto Ayrton. For instance, in 1985, Prost and De Angelis would only suffer 3 retirements apiece that year, so it seems reasonable to apply that same level of reliability and/or luck onto Senna. If we apply those to his 3 weakest hypothetical results, a singular 3rd, 4th and 6th, then nothing changes from our theoretical. But drop 3 wins by the wayside and Senna's points tally drops to 72, 68 with his best 11 results. If we take those wins away from races where Prost doesn't score or has a weaker weekend, Senna could still be a world champion in 1985. We can run any number of permutations through the computer, but the facts remain the same. Senna could have and perhaps should have been in and around the conversation for the world title that year, and the poor reliability of his Lotus, namely his Renault engine, denied him that. There was no time to lose then, yet things came to a screeching halt before 1986 had even begun, with yet more controversy surrounding Senna and contracts swirling about Lotus headquarters. De Angelis had departed for what would be his final F1 shores at Brabham, leaving a vacancy in the Lotus garage. First pick was a talented Brit by the name of Derek Warwick, who had suffered through 2 years of promise but unreliability with Renault, and was on the hunt for a seat to allow him to fulfill his clear potential. A Warwick-Lotus marriage looked perfect for all parties, until Senna stepped in. Though he'd only been at Lotus a year, it was already clear that they needed Senna a hell of a lot more than he needed them. And Ayrton used that knowledge to settle himself into the position of Lotus number 1, and the focal point from which the team would be built around. And wielding said power, he vetoed Warwick's signing. Many saw it as a touch of arrogance plus cowardice. Who did this guy think he was? Was he so insecure of his status, so afraid of how good Warwick might be, that he would throw his toys out of the pram? It would be easy to assume so from the outside looking in, but the truth was that Senna had recognised that Lotus was still far from their former glories. If they wanted any shot of taking on the likes of Williams or McLaren, they needed to concentrate on one top-level driver. Doing so would avoid having to compromise races or disperse the strength of the outfit. Senna insisted that Lotus instead hired countryman and housemate Mauricio Gugelmin, the 1985 British F3 champ, but War, perhaps wishing for some semblance of control within his own outfit and bowing to the pressures of JPS, instead hired, and let me catch my breath on this one, John Colum Crichton Stewart, 7th Marquess of Bute, known by JCC S7 MOB to some, but by Johnny Dumfries to most others. The Scot had also been British F3 champ the year after Senna, but the next year's campaign in Formula 3000 had yielded but a single point. Even Dumfries would immediately recognise this was Senna's team. What tended to happen was that the team would polarise around him, said Johnny. I'd sort of split off with my own race engineer and we'd do our own thing. Dumfries would score only 3 points all year. Spoiler alert, Senna would score several more than that, and never out-qualified Ayrton, regularly being around 4 seconds from the Brazilian's scintillating one-lap pace. Meanwhile, Warwick would race on in F1 until 1993, but never sit in as good machinery as he might have done in that 1986 Lotus. And the Lotus 98T was a very good car. It would be one of the most rapid of Senna's career thus far, taking 8 pole positions from the year's 16 races, only one shy of a then record. In Hungary, he would take Lotus's 104th pole, giving them the record as the constructor with most pole positions. But we know how good Senna was on a Saturday. The question was, in 1986, could he and Lotus do the business on a Sunday? The first of those poles came at the season opener, and it was a hard-fought one. On home turf, his fellow Brazilian Piquet had set the fastest lap ever recorded at the Rio de Janeiro circuit. The patriotic Senna promptly went out and snatched pole with the last lap of the session. Senior team member Steve Hallam recalled, I saw him on the back straight slumped in the cockpit when he'd done it. He'd given everything. Alas, it was all for naught on race day. Though he held the lead from Mansell at the start, Piquet nipped past on lap 3, and that was that. Second place was his first podium at home, but it would be another 5 years until his first home win. Thankfully, it wasn't such a long wait for a win in 1986. In Spain, he was on pole again, this time nearly a second clear of Piquet, and it was here we saw another example of why Lotus bonded around Ayrton. Though he'd already secured a dominant pole, Senna insisted he could go even faster. He'd been sat in the car replaying laps in his mind and was convinced he could set a lap time of a 1:21.6. Waugh ordered new tyres to go on the Lotus. Out went Senna, and he improved his time to a 1:21.6. It is this sort of thing which gets a team solidly behind the driver, wrote Christopher Hilton in his biography of Senna. They slog and labour to create a fast machine, and the driver repays them by making it the fastest machine on the track. Sunday brought a titanic slog with Mansell for the lead, with the two separated by a B's unmentionables at the line, Ayrton winning by 0.014 seconds. With that, Senna took the championship lead. A third consecutive pole in San Marino tied the record for most consecutive poles from the start of the year, but Senna soon plummeted down to 4th place by lap 4, and by lap 12 it became a nothing place when a wheel bearing failed. Given Rosberg would retire late on, a third successive podium was definitely on. Back-to-back Rostrums followed in Monaco and Belgium, but not without some caveats. At Monaco, he qualified lowly, for Senna anyway, 3rd, after dealing with traffic throughout qualifying, leaving little room for progress, especially against the superior McLaren duo that day. In Belgium, he led when Piquet's turbo went, having tracked the Williams early on, but lost the lead to Mansell at the stops, not helped by suffering from big understeer throughout, which may well have been a knock-on from an early incident with Prost and Gerhard Berger. Provisional pole in Canada was snatched away on Saturday, and then a pressing move from Prost forced Senna to lift and scatter across the curbs, which sent a cacophony of cars through. It took a few laps to get by the Ligier of René Arnoux for 5th place, and no further progress was made. Thankfully, things went a little more right on the other side of the North American border, and at Detroit, he righted the wrongs of the previous year, converting pole into win, assisted by brake troubles for Mansell. Senna had regained the lead of the championship on 36 points, hotly pursued by Prost on 33 and Mansell on 29, but hopes of an already long overdue championship challenge would soon begin to falter. From pole in France, he was then outbraked into the first corner. On lap 4, the engine of Andrea de Cesaris's Minardi blew, laying a banana-esque oil spill obstacle at the Signes corner. Senna hit it, and then the tyre barrier. "I didn't see the oil in time and lost it. No excuses," said Ayrton. Perhaps frustrated by that blunder, he was unusually ragged in qualifying for Britain, but was running in 3rd before the gearbox failed. 2 potential podiums had been lost there, but were regained with consecutive 2nd places in Germany and Hungary. Hockenheim in particular showed how hard Senna was pushing to be in the mix. On a notoriously fuel-hungry circuit, Senna had to resort to weaving his car across the final straight in an attempt to slosh the few remaining fuel droplets into his engine. Another second should have followed in Austria, but engine troubles plagued him throughout the weekend and took him out within 13 laps. It should be noted that whilst a podium was on the cards that day, it would have been one not so much all over the gearboxes of the leaders, but one more earned from the fact that all who started in front of him that day, bar Prost, would retire. But points are points, in the same way a goal is a goal, whether it's scored from 30 yards out or a simple tap-in, and 2nd place that day, deserved or not, would have left the championship table reading Mansell 55, Senna 54, Prost on 53. Instead, Senna was 7 points adrift, and more mechanical maladies came along in Italy and Portugal. The first was a clutch issue, taking him out before he could even creep forward. With so little data, we can only assume matching his starting slot that day of 5th was the minimum possible. The second came after a brilliant afternoon of defensive driving, keeping Piquet at bay only to run out of fuel on the final lap and coast home in 4th rather than 2nd. The loss of those 3 precious points meant Senna was now out of mathematical contention for the title. Granted, adding in a few more droplets of fuel to allow him to take 2nd in Portugal would have still left him 16 points back with just 18 to play for. But Kimi Raikkonen was 17 points behind with 20 left to play for in 2007. And with Senna's never say never attitude, who's to say what could have happened? Mexico would bring his 8th and last pole of the year, and one that Senna claims could have been half a second quicker were it not for the lumps and bumps of the old circuit. but the next day would only be third, outclassed by Berger and Piquet. Lost amidst the backdrop of the title showdown in Australia, one he could have and should have been a part of, Senna was instead a bit part player and would have been set for a podium to round out the year, if not for yet another engine failure. Once again, Senna ranked 4th for the year, now with 55 points to his name, 17 shy of that fabled first title. So what could have been? If we once again return to the reality of perfect reliability, it's interesting to note that Senna didn't lose any wins through misfortune as opposed to the truckload that went MIA the previous year. But he did lose out on a lot of points, 29 in fact, which turns his points tally from 55 to 84, more than anyone else scored. But sticking to the rules and counting his best hypothetical 11 results, those 84 points turn into 62, which doesn't even elevate him above 4th place. It means that even if we average his reliability record out to match that of Prost with just 2 retirements all year, nothing would change for Ayrton. Whereas 1985 was more of a cut and dry argument, it's difficult to do the same for 1986. A lack of reliability didn't deprive Ayrton a world title this time, so what did? The black and white statistics of 8 poles, only 2 of which were converted to a win, do have the telltale markings of a latter-day Leclerc. To me, it seems the truth lies within the fact that 1986 was an exceptionally competitive year. We live in a time period where the world title has regularly been decided by the first corner of the first lap of the first race of the year. But 1986 was a mouth-watering, thigh-rubbing, absolute humdinger of a scrap between the best names in the business. Lotus and Senna were good, but so too were Williams, McLaren, Mansell, Piquet and Prost. Between those 4 drivers they won 15 of the 16 races. Only once all year did a podium feature less than 2 of those 4, and the quartet snaffled up 2/3 of the points available that year. Though we can argue that if such and such had been different it could have given Senna the world title, you can argue the same for everyone else that year. Piquet was just 1 turbo failure shy of another championship, whilst Mansell was just a blown tyre away from the same fate. Any one of the 4 deserved the world title, and so a 4th place finish this year might as well be akin to a runner-up spot given the fine margins between them all. There is perhaps a telling quote from the author Hilton, which sums up the whole situation rather nicely. Even Senna was constricted by the art of the possible, and maybe the Lotus, promising as it was, just couldn't beat the likes of Williams or McLaren. Maybe one last Lotus title just wasn't possible. 2 years had passed and Senna had no titles to show for his troubles. Lotus had given him 2 cars, both competitive enough to win races, but just not fast enough nor reliable enough to transform that potential into a championship. Now 27, he was reaching the peak of his potential, this perfect blend of youth, experience and hunger. His next career choice would be a crucial one. Would he stick with Lotus or would he twist? There was a growing sense that 1987 would be make or break for the Lotus-Senna partnership, that if this coming year didn't take Senna to the title, he'd be off somewhere that could provide it to him. And there were several interested parties too. Front and centre were McLaren, seeking a replacement for the retired Rosberg. They'd approached Senna, but the reigning champions were unable to untangle the Brazilian from his Lotus contract. Lotus read that message loud and clear. They knew they had to do all they could to not only appease their mercurial talent, but to finally get the edge over their competitors. The old 98T was thrown into a bag, shaken up, poured out, and what emerged as the 1990 was quite a different beast. The first notable change was the loud zoomy thing located at the rear of the car. Gone were Renault, and in came Honda. Senna had witnessed firsthand the rapidly improving power and durability of the Honda V6 during his duel with the Williamses in the last 2 years, whilst his gremlin-infested Renault had been blowing up and running dry. Add to that an obvious difference behind the scenes in the mentalities of the 2 parties, with Renault's interest in F1 on the decline, whilst Honda were fully invested in taking their engines to the very top. Senna insisted Honda power was the way to go, to the point that he would walk if it could not be arranged. Arms sufficiently twisted, Waugh reached an agreement with Honda in July 1986 for engines one development step behind Williams, and to also dump Dumfries in favour of Honda protégé Satoru Nakajima as his second driver. Next on Senna's shopping list was an insistence to up the team's development budget, prompting Waugh to slither cap in hand to the Lotus sponsors and beg for an increase in funds. But JPS balked at the mere prospect of increasing the input above $2.5 million a year, not helped by Lotus's booting of the British Dumfries, leaving a reluctant Waugh to seek alternate sponsors, eventually securing a tasty $7 million annual investment from Camel. Gone went arguably one of F1's most iconic liveries, and slapped on was a yellow-blue combination that wouldn't have looked out of place in IKEA. The final and most important change was one that evoked memories of the countless innovations Chapman and Lotus had pioneered before. It was one that Lotus chief mechanic Bob Dance believes was the only reason Senna stayed on for 1987. A new technical marvel, active suspension. A constantly moving suspension system that would ensure every corner and every straight would be taken at a height that would achieve optimal aerodynamic efficiency. With that came better speed, better grip, and an improvement of tyre degradation. It was mooted that with a perfectly working active suspension, the Lotuses could theoretically run entire Grand Prix without stopping for tyres, an enormous strategic advantage. The concept had first been tested by Lotus in 1982, on the same day that Chapman would suffer his fatal heart attack. What a fitting tribute it would have been to the great man to see his final idea lead his team to one more title. It all sounded a little too good to be true, and well, it sort of was. When the active suspension worked, it provided the enormous leap forward that Senna sought. The catch was just how often it actually worked. As technology went, it ranked somewhere around trying to teach a nan how to operate a TV remote, a fiendishly complicated experience. It had 20 different sensing systems, all sending the team info at a rate of just over 1 billion inputs every lap. Within that, it offered up around 60 different variables, making both optimal setup and debugging an extremely tricky process. It was the latest of calls too. Senna claimed that the team would only decide to run the active suspension 2 weeks before the season opener, but that it was a choice he was 100% on board with. Murray Walker chimed in, "If this active suspension works, they'll be unbeatable. If it doesn't, they'll be in real trouble." So how would this amalgamation of advances fare? Their performance in Brazil suggested it was perhaps closer to the latter than the former. Senna spun during Friday qualifying, complaining the car felt terrible. Things improved on Saturday and he qualified third, but 2 seconds adrift of Mansell on pole. Come race day, he yo-yoed up into the lead by lap 8, then into the pits on lap 14 with handling problems, back out in 8th, clambered up to 2nd, before an oil tank problem forced him out. Thankfully, race day in San Marino was relatively uneventful. Mansell slotted out behind Senna on the approach to Villeneuve early on and took the lead, and it was one of those days where the Brit was simply in another class to the rest of the field, and Ayrton had to be content with second, nearly half a minute adrift, with more handling woes. More notable was Senna's pole that weekend. It extended Lotus's record of poles to 107, but little did anyone know it would be the last Lotus pole ever. Round 2 of Senna versus Mansell came in Belgium, though this one ended in tears for all parties. On the first lap after a restart, the two went into the same corner side by side. Their wheels touched and both spun off. Neither party was terribly impressed with the other, with Mansell going so far as to accost Senna in the Lotus pits. Battered and bruised in more ways than one, the start of the season had gone less than according to plan, but as the next 2 rounds drew closer, Senna and his Lotus crew could be found licking their lips. Next up was Monaco, and then Detroit. 2 street circuits where the powers of the active suspension could work at their best, and that combined with Senna's street circuit skills could only mean one thing: Back-to-back wins, the first wins for an actively suspended car, you might hesitantly ask? Bang on the money, replies me, and you get a gold star. Mansell took pole by 6/10 from Senna at Monaco and took off into the lead. Ayrton followed suit, watching and waiting for an opportunity. It came when Mansell's turbo failed and Senna took the lead and never looked back. So dominant was his performance, he set the fastest lap of the race towards the end, quote, just to keep my concentration up. It marked the first of many, many Monaco wins for the Brazilian. Nigel beat Ayrton to pole in Detroit too and once again led the race, but a disastrous pit stop with a jammed right rear wheel nut let Senna through once more. Senna too was suffering his own issues, a soft brake pedal, but for once it actually helped him. By slowing his pace, he saved his tyres and was able to coast home without stopping. Walker described it as a blend of superior driving, tactics and machinery, as Senna returned to the championship summit once more. The combination of Senna's brains and talents, Honda power and the seemingly superb Lotus 99T looked primed for that world title run. But those more cautious still had questions. Senna and Lotus were on a hot streak, but one born from the two slowest, bumpiest tracks on the calendar. Just how would they fare at the near 120-mile-an-hour French round to follow? Not well. Senna was fourth in France, then third at the equally high-speed Silverstone and Hockenheim circuits, and on all three occasions that was as good as it could get. When quizzed on his performance in France, Senna simply responded, "No car problem, I couldn't keep up." Though War claimed that Lotus were just 2% behind Williams, quickly it was becoming apparent that Lotus simply weren't good enough. Senna had been a minute adrift of the leaders in France, and then lapped in both Britain and Germany. Early season wins had masked the Lotus deficiencies on tracks which allowed the active suspension to work at its best, and were assisted by both Senna's street track supremacy and messy moments for Mansell on both occasions. And now it was unable to provide the same benefit at other circuits as it could on street circuits, whilst despite the much vaunted Honda engine in the back of the car, it was clear to all that Honda's other team, Williams, were benefiting from their 5-year relationship with the marque in being able to generate an all-round superior package than Lotus. Senna was still second in the table, just 4 points shy of Piquet, but it was increasingly clear that it was a position owing more to consistency, and without the package to beat any of his rivals on race day on pure pace. Shortly after Germany, Senna gave War the news that had been long coming. Senna would not be at Lotus for 1988. It seemed fitting that after the contract shenanigans that began the Lotus story, more should bookend the concluding chapters. On the Wednesday before the Hungarian Grand Prix, Lotus signed soon-to-be champion Piquet. Yet Senna didn't hear any news of this until he arrived at the circuit. It amazes me that a company as big and famous as Lotus should behave so unprofessionally, grumbled Ayrton, neatly forgetting the hubbub of his own signing. War retorted it was quite obvious Senna thought he was going to be the first to sit down in the game of musical chairs and that everyone else would follow. I wasn't prepared to wait for him and run the risk of having to choose from the leftovers. It was all far more exciting than the race for Senna, a distant second, and one that mostly benefited from others' misfortune. Fifth in Austria was almost admirable after becoming involved in the shambolic sequence of starts that day, eventually starting from the pit lane in his spare car. From 18th he entered the points by lap 13 before an incident with Alboreto sent him back to the pits. Once more though, he crawled through the pack to take 2 hard-earned points. With the gap to Piquet ever increasing, it was time to go all guns blazing. Ayrton declared that in Italy I wanted to win this one or be nowhere. He dropped from 4th to 6th early on but rolled the bones on another no-stop race, or else it was lost, he said. By lap 25 he led by 14 seconds from Piquet, but the tyre wear caught up soon enough and off he went for a trip across the gravel. Piquet took the lead, but Senna was on the charge and just 1.8 seconds shy at the finish, despite tyres with no grip and setting fastest lap to boot. Away from the circuit came some wholly unsurprising news. Senna was off to McLaren for 1988. The farewell tour was in motion, yet there was still a notion of hope. that it could end on the highest of notes with Senna still second in the championship, only 14 points behind and with 5 rounds still to go. But what promptly followed was a dreadful run of races. There were no points in Portugal, where he ran 4th early on before an intermittent engine cutout sent him to the pits and back out in 22nd. His resulting charge to 7th, 4 seconds shy of the points, was mighty, if pointless. With championship hopes dwindling in Spain, Senna went all in on another no-stop race. I knew that if I came in, the best I could hope for was maybe 4th or 5th. I decided to stay out, fight and hope the tyres would last, recalled Ayrton. Admirably, he held second until 10 laps from the end before the tyres screamed enough and the trailing conga of cars all slipped through. Senna was 5th at the flag and in need of a big old miracle to pull off a championship upset. Running 3rd in Mexico, his clutch failed, and with 9 laps left, while attempting to change down without it, the brakes locked. Senna spun, the car stalled, and the marshals refused to push start him. As he exited the car, the pain of accepting another lost championship roared from Ayrton, and a nearby official was the unfortunate victim of that frustration. When Mansell crashed heavily in practice for Japan, it confirmed Piquet as champion, but also left the door open for Senna to vault past the Brit into 2nd place in the table. A steady 3rd became an opportunistic 2nd at the final corner of the final lap. The season and the Lotus years should have then ended with a bang. Adelaide, Australia, a street circuit, the most savoury of morsels for Senna and the 99T to gobble up. But he could only qualify 4th, and though he scythed past Alboreto and Prost, breaking lap record after lap record in the process, he was unable to best Berger that day. Still, 2nd place was enough for the runner-up spot in the World Championship, or would have been had Lotus not been disqualified for running irregular brake ducts. A finale of champagne and celebrations instead ended with Senna going off in a huff because we had really let him down, recounts Dance. Senna instead ranked 3rd, 16 points from Piquet and just a dodgy brake duct away from the silver medal position in the drivers' table. But for such a fiercely competitive individual, it would have been akin to being first of the losers. His perfect season would have had 87 points rather than the actual 57, which comfortably trumps all others once more. Make that into his best 11 results and you get a figure of 71. Adapt Piquet's points tally to include the time Senna would have beaten him, and Nelson drops to 64, another lost world title. With one of the better reliability records of his Lotus tenure, little needs to be adapted, factoring that into place too. Whereas 1985 can be blamed on reliability and 1986 on the relentless competitiveness of his fellow championship challengers, the failings of 1987, for the first time perhaps fall squarely on the shoulders of one Ayrton Senna. He had hustled and bustled his car to the upper echelons every year, but those honest, hyper-competitive intentions to enact the changes he deemed necessary to elevate Lotus into championship contenders may well have been the cause for a 3rd straight titleless season. First was the insistence for active suspension. As we've discussed, a finicky little beast, one that when it was right was fantastic, when it was wrong was not. Making a case for whether it should have been implemented is a tricky one. On one hand, Lotus clearly needed something that would provide a key upgrade and give them the crucial advantage of their competitors. In this sport, if you're not moving forward, you're standing still, and technological innovation is so often the name of the game. And active suspension had all the hallmarks of maybe being just like so many other Chapman concepts. When Williams implemented it a few years later, their FW14B became one of F1's fastest, most dominant, and most technologically advanced cars to grace the F1 grid. Yet here was one that, simply put, just wasn't right. Those moments of hitting that sweet spot came around too few, too sparingly. Reading through a review of the year, the pages are littered with complaints from Senna regarding the car's lack of balance and stability. The truth was, it overcomplicated matters, as evidenced by how the passively suspended Williams outshone it, and the later semi-active Williams introduced at Monza only elongated that existing gap. Next, we have the switch to Honda power. Granted, Renault had proven unreliable and increasingly disinterested in F1, and Honda seemed to be on the up and up. But there are questions too over whether Honda power made a great difference to the Lotus package. Though it placated his main man, it was a change that Waugh was unconvinced was necessary. In 1988, he was quoted as saying, "The Renault engine was a better engine than Senna made it appear. That his throttle control technique of gently blipping it through the corners contributed to the troubles with fuel consumption." And Waugh provided receipts to that hypothesis too. Amongst the 4 Honda-powered drivers in 1988, Senna's fuel consumption was by far the worst. Playing devil's advocate, Waugh also mooted the idea that maybe the Renault was fantastic and powerful, and the chassis wasn't that good, and Senna was having to drive it above the level of which it was capable of being driven to be competitive, which was why the fuel consumption was bad. Any hopes at rectifying these problems were dashed by Senna too. Waugh had moved heaven and earth to make these changes, and yet still, it seemed as if Senna's faith in the Lotus project was rapidly dissipating. Perhaps in an attempt to force a move through to McLaren, Senna claimed his 1987 contract was no longer valid, as he had signed for JPS Lotus and would require an extra $5 million on his salary for the trouble of signing a new contract for Camel Team Lotus. The vast chunk of cash that could have and should have been spent on Lotus's development instead went into the pockets of Ayrton, to the detriment of all involved. Yet despite those poor choices, it was arguably only the brilliance of Senna that masked some of the deficiencies of the 99T. A better view for the kind of machine it was is perhaps best perceived through the prism of teammate Nakajima. Granted, Satoru was not within the same solar system in terms of talent levels compared to Senna, but for a driver who would become a solid midfield operator across the next 5 years, the gaps of up to 4 seconds from Ayrton in qualifying perhaps pointed to a more difficult car than bad driver. Away from this Senna bashing, it can be undeniable that change was clearly necessary if Lotus were going to get anywhere. It's just that the changes implemented weren't necessarily the right ones. I think he felt Lotus weren't good enough for him in the sense of where he wanted to go, says Dance. At the time we weren't looking as good as McLaren, and he was setting his sights higher still. Lotus was not progressing. It was stagnant. In 1988, Senna would claim that long overdue first world title in his first season at McLaren, and 2 more would follow across the next 3 years, in and around a vicious rivalry with Prost, before Ayrton's tragic passing on the 1st of May 1994, leaving behind a long list of what-ifs and what could-have-beens. His record of 65 pole positions remains untouched for over a decade, and perhaps fittingly it has only been passed by 2 others in the conversation for GOAT status, Lewis Hamilton and Michael Schumacher. But for many, Senna remains the greatest racing driver to have ever lived. While Senna's story went on the up, Lotus's went the other way. The active suspension concept was binned off for 1988, whilst a storm of internal politics and uncertainty over Piquet's signing prompted Duca Rouge and designer Martin Ogilvy to hand in their notices. Hopes of championships became a distant memory, and the reward for the year was just 3 third places. By 1989, Honda had left, and not long after, so did Waugh. Points tallies began to dwindle, and by the end of 1994, easily missed amongst the drama of the infamous collision of Schumacher and Damon Hill, the Lotus of Mika Salo ground to a halt on lap 49 of the Australian Grand Prix, and it was the last time Lotus would appear on an F1 grid. By February 1995, Lotus was wound up with debts of over £12 million. Though the name rose from the ashes to grace the grid once more in 2010, first with Tony Fernandez's team Lotus, and then latterly Renault's successor Lotus Renault GP, neither held any physical links to the original outfit. Senna had provided the real Lotus with its final shot at glory, and everything since was just a pale imitation. So, to circle back to our original question, what was the Lotus legacy of Ayrton Senna? One of unfulfilled potential, perhaps? Could or should Ayrton have walked away from Lotus with one or more world titles to his name? The statistics will tell us that, in a perfect world, Ayrton would have been a 3-time champion in his time at Lotus. That in that perfect storm he would have scored more points than anyone each year. I know this blindly and stubbornly ignores the championship criteria of the time, which, if we do that with any year, with any rules, means we could warp into a reality where just about anybody could be a world champion. But I feel that few would argue against the logic that the driver who scores more points than any other, 99 times out of 100, is a deserving champion. But here's the funny thing about perfection. Someone once asked Senna about the perfect lap, to which Senna replied, "It is like tying both ends of your tie so that they are exactly the same length. Experience tells you that you can do it, practice tells you that you can do it, but you can't." Everything about the Lotus legacy of Ayrton Senna will tell you that Senna had everything one could possibly want at an outfit. Clear number one status, a competitive team built around him, motivated by him, his pick of power units, of technology. And Lotus had a focal point, someone who could take their creations and take them to their absolute maximum. Take that pole position of Spain 1986 when Senna insisted he could go even faster despite an unassailable lap time and went and did so. So why did that not harmonise together for a championship symphony? 1985 is a mercifully simple one. A litany of engine failures and mishaps dropped a bundle of points by the side of the road. Machinery more in line with reliability records of the time, let alone a fantastical bulletproof brick, would have made Ayrton Senna a world champion ahead of schedule. The missed opportunity there was a golden one. For while Senna made efforts to maximise the potential of Lotus by focusing on his efforts, it was not enough to stem the tide of others. By 1986, the list of opponents had trebled in size and drastically improved their performances. All came within an if and or but of the world title that year, which leaves 1987 and the gamble that couldn't quite pay off. Some will call those choices made the right ones, others the last act of a desperate soul, and maybe one that wouldn't have taken those chances had that first domino from 1985 toppled. We'll never know. It may just be as simple as Lotus weren't good enough for Senna. Stepney has said he expected everything to be right, and in those days at Lotus it was hard in any specific car to get it absolutely right to the point he wanted. In some respects, he expected a lot more than you could actually do for him. Thus, it would be easy to read that and declare this 3 years of wasted potential. But this tale should not read as a failure for either Lotus or Ayrton. One thing that is abundantly clear: Senna took Lotus and lifted it. He exuded an energy that hadn't been felt there since the death of Chapman, not from DeAngelis, Mansell or any other. He was the kind who could pull out a second, and that second would come from him, not the car, recalls Stepney. And whilst it might not have been the crowning return to glory that he and others would have dreamed of, it was one final moment in the sun for Lotus. His Lotus legacy may not be one of total success, but it was one of scintillating pace, daring innovations and a long-forgotten taste of champagne. For a man whose own team has rapidly descended down the ranks, even I would not begrudge one final victory, even if it was served alongside the frustration of failing to convert that to anything more. One can make the argument that the Lotus years made Senna. The Ayrton who entered Lotus was quite a different beast to the one who left 3 years later. 1985 Senna was perhaps his most human. He would holiday with Elio De Angelis, while Chief Mechanic Dance recalls that Ayrton was a good sport with the lads and not above a practical joke or two. But as the media continued to swirl and results failed to materialise, it generated a harder, more determined Ayrton Senna, one who was fit to go toe-to-toe with the likes of Prost in the grittiest of circumstances. In a weird, contrived way, Lotus did give Senna 3 world titles, just not quite how one would expect. You can be sure that Senna would have loved nothing more than one final celebration for such an iconic and missed outfit. But as we all know, even Senna was constricted by the art of the possible. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pitbox of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pitwall that it's the best strategy available for you.